some of these areas and give some recommendations as we go through. So first off, and I'm going to cover some of these details as we move along, but here are the key things that I would look for in terms of your planning. Super basic, but one of the things that changes in terms of the endpoints, and you'll see this in the next slide, of, well, hey, we were doing integration with the graph, now it's something different. And it seems like it's not a big deal, and to some degree, it's not, except many times if you have a legacy applications, sometimes we hardwire those things in and we expect them to come in, and they will, and normally they hide themselves in terms of authentication and authorization. If you did a good job putting it in your config files, that's great if you've already developed an application, but you got to double check it. So testing is going to be key on here if you're somebody who, and there are customers that actually that maintain 2 tenants. We have 25% of our business in government, so we need to have that space. But we have 75% of our other business that we don't have that. So because of cost or scale or separation concerns, we actually maintain 2 separate tenant types. And in that case, well, what happens if you want to build an application that can do both? I'll cover that a little bit and some of the things to think about, but you can do that, but you still have to have those different tenants, and your application has to understand how to split those if you did want to do something like that. The other part is just how do we scope it down to make sure we're only getting the things that we need. And I'll talk about each one of these a little bit more. But these are the areas that at the very beginning, takes a lot of testing, validating, where does the data go, those sorts of areas. But this is a place that if you don't spend enough time and just say, oh, it's just just a different endpoint. It's login.microsoft.us.com. What's the big deal? You'll find out here in a little bit. So those are the quick ones to look at. So first off, and I provide a link here at the bottom, pretty simple to see that for Azure AD, and that's the thing. We talk about Azure Commercial, which is also Azure, global services. So this is the traditional, portal.azure.com, stick in a credit card, pay Agile IT to do licensing, whatever. This is the endpoint that your applications are going to look for. One is the portal where you log into, and the other one is the endpoint. Now, the endpoint is important because even though Azure AD has these 2 different endpoints, there's more that goes to that story in terms of multi-tenant versus single tenant, and I might be able to show something about that as well. But first part is this: there's lots of other places in terms of the graph that has other endpoints for the blob storage, other endpoints for the virtual machines. There's lots, but right now we're talking really around the identity part of it. So I kind of just scoped it to this, that you have to be mindful of when you do things like registration and consent. So one thing to make note of is when you have an application, and I'll talk a little bit about this in terms of doing the registration part of it, but there's really 2 kind of categories of scope. There's delegated and there's application permission. So when we create an app registration, when we say we're building a new application, my application is going to need to be able to do things. Well, the first part is you can say, well, if the doing things means when a user logs in, that we're going to provide, let's say, a UI, and there'll be other talks that talks about different ways you can do this on the server side. To do it that way. There's also on the client side, if you're using the client libraries, or a really good one is the Microsoft Graph Toolkit. Really cool things that they have in there. Either way, what level of access does the application have when it's doing things? So the first part is delegate. So if your application says, I'm going to do user read or even user read write, what it means is that when I have the application that has this scoping, right? So we register, we say this is the scoping we want, and it's been approved. I'll cover that in a little bit. That the application is going to do things on behalf of the user. So it's going to say, oh, since Conrad has logged in and I have been scoped out to do with these permissions, I can only see and do things based off of what the logged in person has. So this is delegated permissions. You're essentially saying the application go ahead and do things based off the user that's logging in. So even though the application runs as a service principal, it's only going to do that. Application permissions are different because a user, in this case, I may want a user to log in. And again, I'm not saying this is the right way to architect, just it creates a clear example. And I want a user to log in, and I want to be able, the application wants to be able to list all of the users and its properties maybe, maybe even more, and maybe even change those properties, even though the user themselves don't have that right. Now, a scenario why you may want to do that is because, well, I don't really want to give that person the right to do that in Azure Active Directory, let's say, because I want to use an application so I can do maybe other approvals. I have another kind of process, naming patterns, maybe it's onboarding a new user or offboarding a user. And so going through the application allows me to say, I can have the user put in the request, take some actions, and then now that the application has the rights to do it, they can take that action on the back end. Now, the ability to scope that and manage that is a whole nother topic, but this is really when you think of, well, a user can log in, I validate you, I know you are Conrad, and now my application, who's being consented by the IT department or whomever, said yes, the application can do this. It's fine because it controls it, audits it, and has a whole flow. So this allows the user to be able to get that experience and the application supported, yet they don't have the direct access if they were to go around the system. So it's a nice way of being able to create that. But you really have to be mindful of what level of access, because you don't want everybody to have that. And does the application always need to go do that, which is kind of a separate topic. But this is part of the planning of when should we do things, and you can mix them around of when you're going to do things, when you're going to do things with a application kind of permission versus when you're going to do a delegate. So you can control that in code. So it's not like, hey, let's just do application, do everything there. You really should limit it in terms of what you're going to do and when.